So hi, my name is Derek Holzer. It's very funny that I am doing things with video game consoles because I'm one of the few people in the room that probably never really got into video games. I don't think we could afford anything as fancy as this when I was a kid, so I missed out on that childhood computing sort of experience, and I had to catch up with it much later. In this talk, I would like to do a couple of things. There's too much stuff I could talk about, and so I've kind of broken it into a few different things. I'm also going to be doing a keynote tomorrow night that will be a lot more about kind of history and theoretical issues of using media archaeological devices like old game consoles and cathode ray tubes and things like that, and where some of that stuff comes from and the aesthetics of it. So I won't get into that right now. But I do want to talk a little bit about how I came into this. So it's one of those things where you're in a room with people with so many convergent interests, and I think that we all found some of these things at the same time. So actually, I think I also started out looking at, I don't think the oscilloscope graphic artist, but I did start looking at the synth shape really early. I did a residency at a place, a marvelous, fantastic hideaway in upstate New York called Signal Culture. And at Signal Culture, I was doing a toolmaker residence, and so I was trying to kind of freehand this electronic synth shape circuit, and it didn't really work out very well. I like to call it my antisocial sculpture, because instead of going out and meeting all kinds of people and stuff like that, I was kind of busy soldering, which is what you end up doing a little bit. But the Signal Culture experience was really good in other ways because I got to see wobulators and Ruot-Etra scan processors, or Dave Jones's version of it at least, up close, and talk to Dave Jones himself, who is a very interesting guy, and learn a lot about video because I don't know anything about video. I've been working in pure data since about 2002, I think. But entirely from the audio perspective, and I would always work with other people doing visuals. And then I started working a lot with analog stuff, and I started working with optical sound. So I would use optical sensors to translate flickers in light directly into voltage that moves a speaker so that you can hear it. And that's the same kind of technique that a 35 millimeter or 16 millimeter film projector uses with these optical soundtracks on the side. And that's when I started getting into this hybridizing image and sound, and I really wanted that there was a direct connection between the image and the sound, which is, I think, something that a lot of us are seeking out. And it's something that certainly Chris and Hansi are talking about a lot when they're using this oscilloscope music, is what you see is what you hear. And so I was very interested in making that linkage. And so I spent a lot of time trying to make this synth shape thing with just kind of prototyping board and things like that, and it didn't really work out very well. The chips in it are really expensive, and I found these shorts, and I could never find out where the short circuit was, so I never put the $10 chips in the board and turned it on. It's still sitting in a box somewhere. We'll come back to that. One thing that I do a lot of is that I build analog synthesizers. This particular little blinky box here is two of a circuit called a Benjelin, which is made by was designed by a gentleman from the Netherlands named Rob Hodijk, and he calls it kind of a bent by design synthesizer. So it's very glitchy. It's usually when I make these for people, I tell them that the first week of using it is what the fuck, and then after that they start to discover its idiosyncrasies and how to kind of swim through it. It's very chaotic. So what I started doing was just simply plugging the analog function generators, the oscillators from the Benjelin itself, into the Vectrex, just to see what would happen. So we'll replicate the evolution of my thing here. So now we're looking at Minefield, and this is the default thing that happens every time you turn one of these on and you're not connecting something else to it. And thanks to the wonderful work of Andrew Duff in popularizing this mods, I'm now able to do this, and this, and that. That's actually a different mod. We'll get to that later. So there's two triangle waves. It's actually nice to talk after you, Phil, because I can kind of show these analog oscillators and also the fact that this is totally unsynchronized. So with a lot of finessing, I can make a shape that's stable. That's about as close as it gets. And of course I can change the amplitude of it or something like that. So if you're trying to perform in a live situation and get to, let's say, results that once upon a time you got to before and you found kind of interesting, doing it this way is really difficult because you're kind of dialing around and you're looking for things. The reason that this looks like it does is that it's two triangle waves. I have no idea what the phase relationship is because I can't control that. And this is about as close with these knobs as I can get to them being at unison, which means that they're tuned identically. If I tune one of them higher up, it's too bad we can't hear this right now, but we'll get to parts we can hear later. But at a certain point, there we go. Whoops, almost. Almost staying still. That's probably about as close to an octave apart as I can get. One of these triangle waves is now oscillating at twice the frequency of the other, and that's why we see a figure that has two lobes. These are referred to as Lissajous figures. What's the other guy's name, by the way? There was another guy, they could have named it after Lissajous, which they mostly do, and then they called him another thing, and I don't have that on the tip of my tongue, sorry. Maybe Hansi knows. Anyway, so this is an octave relationship, and if I were to able to change the waveforms of these, then what you would get would be, for example, a more rounded figure. I could try it with square waves. Square waves I have access to, and what you get is pretty close to a square. And if I mess with the other one a little bit, it still kind of stays a square. So now these guys are at some random ratio there. We can kind of try to tune it back. So what's interesting is that when you get harmonics, that looks like 2 octaves up to me. When you get harmonics, you get a figure that is relatively stable and has a pretty distinctive shape. But that's about as far as I could get with this particular machine because it only has a couple of oscillators that I can use, and there's none of this synchronization that kind of lets you hold the figure in place a bit. And of course I can just kind of dial in there and just start making it very chaotic, and you get some interesting stuff. So one other thing that's kind of interesting, which is the step sequencer, which gives you a really nice grid. Maybe if I turn this up, you can hear it. Nope. Anyway, it doesn't matter because we're going to move on to pure data here in a second. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate where I've been doing this stuff. So there was a few tricks that I certainly knew how to do here. And then lots that I would see pictures of on the internet and feel very inadequate because I couldn't do. So, so I spent a long time playing around with hardware, building synthesizers for people. By the way, it's really easy to get lost in your own patches. If you're ever watching people demo this stuff, they tend to get really lost in their things. So I will try to stay focused. So doing lots of hardware, and I did that because I got really tired of, this sort of hiding behind the laptop performance sort of thing. And now I'm back to this. Pure data was probably like one of my first loves, and it's an old love, and it's a love that I'm very familiar with, and it's an environment that I feel very comfortable working in. I'm just starting to get to that place also with analog electronics, which is, it's a beautiful feeling when you can come up with a concept of an idea, and then you know all the steps that are necessary to get to that place. Maybe you don't know how to execute every one of those steps, but at least you know the steps, and that's really important. So I already knew that I needed some control over things besides just the frequency and the wave shape. And a lot of that has to do with these synchronization things, or at least having some control over the phase. So a couple of years ago, I moved to Helsinki, and I started doing some studies again, and I came up with this thesis project that I wanted to explore these oscilloscope graphics and what I started calling vector synthesis before I realized that it was also a kind of a patented audio technology from sequential circuits, or I forget. Anyway, I still call it vector synthesis. So what I started back with my good old friend Pure Data. So I'm gonna have to change the patching just a little bit here. We'll go back to spaceships for a minute. And that should be sine wave. Nice little circle. So I should have some sound as well at this point. Maybe we'll lower the frequency of that. So we've just discovered something interesting about this particular piece of hardware that I'm using. We can look at the PD patch for a second. This particular piece of hardware has this lovely safety feature in it called the spot killer. And we'll go back here for a second, and I'll disable the spot killer. What the spot killer is designed to do is it's designed to protect the CRTs. CRTs work with this kind of electron beam that shoots from the back out to the screen. And if you don't send any, let's say I get rid of that, what you get is that, which is a really horrible thing, and we don't want to leave that there. We don't want to leave that spot there, because what it's going to do is it's going to burn out the phosphorescent lining on the inside of the tube, and eventually you have this kind of burn mark, and that's a place on the screen that doesn't really stay lit anymore. So the engineers that built this thing made this special function, which is if I turn the spot killer off, that circle that I'm drawing isn't moving fast enough to keep the beam going. So I would have to start cranking up the frequency until I found a frequency that was high enough that it defeats this protection mechanism. So it starts around 800 and something hertz. And the other thing is that if that circle gets any smaller, it also disappears. So that's kind of a little devil that bothers everybody that uses these particular Vectrex consoles. So I made it my mission to figure out how to do that. So there's a whole group of people that are they're much more into this retro gaming thing, and they're also, let's say, trained television technician kind of people. And so I got on that group and I started asking them and looking at the schematics and things and trying to figure that out. So a guy named Fred Konopaska, he suggested this, and I tried it and it seemed to work. So there's just one little connection that you can make inside, and then it doesn't bother you anymore. But then you have to be really careful to make sure that you don't make the image too small again. So that's that. We'll make that long story stop. And we'll put some external audio into this now. See if I shock myself again. I don't know which one of these is which, so. So a circle is made by two sine waves. If you can control the phase of the sine waves, then those sine waves should be 90 degrees out of phase. So here in this little PD patch, we can control the frequency, we can control the harmonic that I'll get back to in a second, and we can control the phase, the scale of it, and the brightness. That's what we're able to do in this little thing here. So if I change the phase, you get this lovely rotational sort of effect, which is a very nice thing that our brain does to convince us that it's a 3D figure moving, even though we know that it's not. Here's scale. Again, I can adjust the scale. And the harmonic does something. Right now, the relationship of the two sine waves are the same, so they're both at 200 hertz. Now one of them is going to be twice the frequency. You can hear the octave now. 3 times the frequency. 4 times the frequency, and so on. So those are even divisions. However, if you set it to be a little bit inharmonic, you get some also inharmonic looking shapes as well, which I think are also quite interesting. And obviously we can control the brightness because there's 3 inputs to the Vectrex. One moves the beam up and down, one moves it side to side, and one controls the brightness. Just something that some oscilloscopes don't have. So we can fade it in and out. Actually, the brightness of this is cranked up really high. I'm going to go ahead and turn it down just a bit so that my brightness control will actually work now. There we go. Now I can fade it in and out. In Pure Data, you have objects to bring sounds in. So I'm going to bring a sound in, and I'm just going to add these. I'm going to sum these to the X and Y signals of the circle here. And now we can kind of inject some triangle wave in there. So obviously this one is adding a signal onto the horizontal axis. This one is adding it on the vertical axis. And those aren't the triangle waves, sorry, these are. And if you can tune this guy to a harmonic of the circle, then you've got a kind of this frozen figure again. But it's analog, it's gonna wobble around a little bit. So a lot of my performances are simply setting up really basic shapes with Pure Data that are fairly controllable, and then making them very uncontrolled and wild with the analog synthesizer. This has a built-in kind of a steppy thing that, let's see here, there we go. I'm not hearing it so well, unfortunately, but yeah, you're only getting in mono? Yeah, it's because both channels are the same. I think that the level the synthesizer is coming in is quite a bit lower than the level that's going to the screen, so that's just kind of how we do it here. So I could go through lots of stuff that's in this library. I might demo some of these really fast, because again, there's a lot of convergence of interest, and there's also a lot of discussions, because we're all the people that are developing this stuff. We're all talking to each other, and we're all getting ideas from each other, and in some cases, just out and out plundering. So. This whole library, by the way, is just called Vector Synthesis. It's available on GitHub. Pure Data is also a free environment that you can download and install. And apart from the scan processing stuff that I'll show towards the end, all of the patches run on pretty much any installation of Pure Data. It doesn't use any external libraries that make it more complicated to install. The scan processing stuff, on the other hand, is too complicated. So. So again, we can make a triangle. And this is just through some, mathematical manipulations of things. We can make that a little easier to listen to. So here's the patch. Everything that works in this library is all based on it's all controlled by the phasor waveform, and the phasor waveform is basically is just a triangle, or sorry, it's just a ramp. So let's look at the waveforms that come out. The waveform that's driving this whole thing is a sawtooth. And we use a sawtooth because it's really easy to convert that into any other sort of a wave shape. And also it's very useful if you need to, for example, read a table of data from the beginning of the table to the end of the table and things like that. The waveforms that are coming out here to draw the triangle look a little bit different. I can crank the scale of those up a little bit. And you can see that one is sort of a lopsided pseudo ramp, and the other one is a triangle that's had some little bits of it cut off. So that's one way of drawing a triangle. There's many others as well, but that's one way, and that's simply based on wave shaping. One of the grails of this sort of stuff is this applications of optical electronics incorporated 3D display modules, and it's a PDF that is out there. Chris, who is the author of that? Use the microphone.
His Hologlyphics is his website.
Yes.
And he did a lot of research into 3D vector display and image rotation and the history of it.
Yeah, I don't remember his name right now either. I should write it in here, but anyway, there was lots of math to plunder in there, and as a child I was terrified of math, so I'm always amazed with myself when I can do this stuff. So this is just basically, it's a lot of wave shaping to take that ramp wave form and convert it into something a bit more esoteric that draws our triangle here. So there's several different kind of basic 2D forms you can do in this library. I didn't want this to be a kind of an end user application. I didn't imagine that somebody would just open up one patch from the library and have everything that they wanted to make a live set. I think that's kind of cheating, or at least that's not what I would want if I downloaded something. The kinds of things that I like to download and play around with are toolkits and things that I can kind of configure on my own, and I don't feel like I'm just kind of playing with somebody else's presets. If I wanted to play with somebody else's presets, I probably would have stuck using VSTs back in 1999 and never advanced past that. So I'm glad I did.
Derek, I can't believe I forgot the name. It's Walter Funk, which is just a great name.
Walter Funk. Thank you, Walter. If you're out there somewhere in YouTube land. So for 3D shapes, I had to plunder some other things. Actually, Roland was very useful in pointing me in the direction of this particular way of doing things. Again, everything is driven by a phaser. So the phaser kind of is like a master clock, to which everything is synced. And in this case, what we're doing is we're using a phaser to read some wavetables. And those wavetables contain points of information which are necessary to draw an icosahedron. So all of these shapes live out on the internet as .obj files, so wavefront alias 3D files. And I'm deeply indebted to Hansi and Chris for the Oscilloscope Music Studio software, because it does the work of taking those files and calculating a single path through them that can be used to draw them on 3 axes later. So I use their software, I import the object file, I render it out, or I use their software to render it out. It saves all the points in the XML, then I can pull them out of the XML, and I have a little Python script that breaks them into 3 different tables so that I can use them. It's definitely not a real-time process. It's a process where you have to kind of know what sort of objects you want to be using. And it's nice, you can rotate it, and you can do things like that. Let's listen to it. Oops. The 3D rotation sounds really nice as well. Another very challenging piece of math, at least for me to understand, were these rotation matrices. Because what this is it's three lists of information that are being read. And somehow you need to kind of rotate them and then project them down to two. So that was something that I had to learn. I basically had to learn high school math. All the classes that I never passed in high school, I had to kind of retake on my own with some books. So the rotation matrix. Ooh, can we do that? That's so cheesy looking. I love it. All right. So the rotators work on a very basic form, and I think anybody that's worked, I don't know, doing any kind of 3D graphics or games programming or something kind of knows this very basic sine cosine rotation matrix. So there's one for each axis. This is where I work out my secret fantasies of being a math teacher. I think the most amount of points, at least that OSCE Studio can handle, was resulted in this. It's a lot of points. And it sounds great. It sounds really good, especially at low frequencies. This hand is 18,748 pieces of information on each axis. So there's a lot of information there. And what's interesting about the Vectrex is that it's very limited in its bandwidth. You'll see that if I start to crank the frequency up and it tries to render that much information, you get these lovely deformations of it. Right now we're only rendering it at about 30 hertz. If I put it at 1,000, it's just too much information. It just simply squashes it, so it can't move the beam fast enough to actually represent all that information. And if I do it at, I don't know, 4 hertz or something, you can see that it's actually really quite detailed, but you don't get the whole picture at once, which is also kind of nice. Yeah, let's hear that a little louder. So that's a really fun one. I like that one a lot. I'm still working on some stuff using different algorithms to import simple 2D art, like an SVG from Inkscape. But I'm not going to demo that yet because I don't have it. I don't think I have a demo of that ready. Maybe I do. Let's see. I worked on it so many weeks ago, I don't remember what it's called anymore. Oh, Object 2D, here we go. There's one, and is that the other one? I'm not sure. Nope, that doesn't look like that's right. I think that's supposed to be an eye or something. See, I didn't prep this one so well, so. It's kind of a triangle with an eye in it. I think I'm trying to draw it too fast. There we go. Yeah. Oh, hi. Yeah, there we go. So we've got the Illuminati in the house. And that's simply taking a, this uses another third-party something or other. to take an SVG file, and it should be rendered into something called well-known text, which is a 2D format that's used for embedding line artwork in GPS maps and things like that. And then from well-known text, I have another Python script that breaks it up into two different things. So, but the well-known text does the same thing. It kind of finds one pathway through all the established shapes. It's not super impressive. This is not nearly as impressive as what Ted's doing with processing, so I'm feeling very inadequate here. So what I feel very adequate about, finally, after a long time, scan processing is kind of, for a lot of people in this whole video circuits thing, it's definitely one of those holy grails. It's one of those things like once you work out how that trick works, and then you work out in your own environment, whether it's a hardware environment or a software environment, how that works, it just, you feel like you've really got somewhere. You feel, it feels very powerful. Yes. Scan processing essentially comes from either the Scanimate or the Rudetra, which I'm sure I and several other people will be talking about. I know Jonas is going to be talking a lot about scan processing later, so I won't go so far into the details. But essentially the takeaway for the moment is that you're using an audio signal to read the luminosity information of, in this case, it could be either a photograph, it could be a video file on the hard drive being played, or it could be a camera input. So you're using audio signals to get the luminosity information, and then you can do things with that luminosity. So let's jump in and have a look at it, because this is the thing that I've been engineering in this library the longest. This particular process, I got inspired by Cliff, because Cliff did this RE We're Here application. And he released it around the same time that I released the first components of the vector synthesis library, but I hadn't gotten anywhere near the point of doing scan processing. So, we talked about it. You sent me these sketches, and I was like, I think I know how to do that. I think I can get that.
It was actually one simple object that I told you what it does. Basically, scans the image, and once you located it in GEM. But it was also that same month was the moment that we crafted vectorhack. So
yeah, it was very. Oh hi, there I am. Okay. So we're gonna catch a little selfie here. Whoops. So that's in there now, and yeah, I've cleaned this up a lot. So let's turn it on, and so there I am. What's the benefit of doing scan processing stuff with a software solution is that you can control the number of lines. You can control a lot of the parameters. You're not stuck with the normal video raster, which has whatever 512 lines and a very fixed frame rate. This right now is working with not 80 lines. So I can mess around with, let's say, the number of lines. And as I get the lines higher and higher, you see the bandwidth of the Vectrex just eats it. It just squashes it. We're at 210 lines now, and there's kind of not anything there anymore. But as I get less and less lines, the quality of it gets much sharper. You can also use a different kind of a thing. You can use vertical lines. I happen to like this grid function quite a bit. So here, what I'm doing is I'm using the luminosity information of wherever wherever we're scanning the image at the moment, and we're doing two things with it. We're modulating the beam intensity of the Vectrex, and we're also using it to kind of push the image out into a curvature in the z-axis. Now, in the original the Scanimate and the Rudetra, there wasn't any sort of 3D rendering going on there. It was a 2D image, and to get that sort of 3D image, you usually applied this brightness to the vertical axis. So if I get rid of that z deflection, and did I even get rid of it? No, here I can. I'll just add it back in. So here's the brightness. And here's, oops, so the original one would do something like this. Let's scale it a little bigger. Oops. So the original Redetro would do something like this. It would simply add the luminosity to the vertical of it, and so you would get these kind of things where it would lift up or pull down or something like that. Since this is actually using kind of a 3D projection thing, I can do all sorts of other stuff to it. So we'll add some Z back to it. And because it's just points in space now, we can kind of rotate it around as well. We can get the live camera back. There's my hand. You can see. And more face action. Oops, didn't get it. And of course, you can kind of zoom into it, which is something that you can't really do as easily, or let's say as, well, you can't do this with it. You can't kind of zoom down to kind of pixel level almost. So here we're pretty close to like pixel level. And if you kind of zoom around a little, you can even see the pixels. And they do these weird steppy things sometimes. So you can get like super abstract and rotate that around a little bit. It becomes something else entirely. It doesn't even become a photorealistic image anymore. And of course, we can also pull some external signal back into it. Oops. So we'll add some triangles to the, at least that should. Oh, that's why. And the sound of scan processing is a little bit monotonous because you're getting the lines and the frames mostly. So let's zoom back out. Am I there again? I'm kind of there. So here's a kind of a transformation of the scan processed image with this triangle wave from this. And you see that if you find a harmonic of either the horizontal or the vertical, you get this kind of slow, drifty sort of thing, which is really quite nice. Yeah, it is. It's quite dim there. I'm going to just turn it up here, actually. There we go. Sorry about that. Why didn't you guys say something? So again, this is at one point started its life as a photorealistic image, but it turns into other things very rapidly, which I think is really quite nice. Now I'm just rotating it again. So again, this whole library, the scan processing part relies on an external library called GEM, which it hasn't really been updated in about 10 years, so it's quite old and cranky and doesn't really run on everything. So that getting the scan processing part working with pure data on the computer sometimes can be really a bit challenging. I'm actually hoping that at some point I can re-script the part that does the image analysis in something like Open Frameworks and use an external called Ophelia that exists inside of Pure Data that allows a bridge between Open Frameworks and Pure Data, and that might make this a much more efficient, easier, and perhaps more portable bit of thing. So again, this is the patch again, and there's lots of hardware and software requirements to get it looking really good on this, but almost all the other patches don't use this brightness, so they can run on any sort of an oscilloscope, which is also quite nice. I'm going to kill this, and maybe we'll look at one more thing since we've been going back to basics, which is this implementation of the synth shape, just to see how that would look implemented digitally. And actually, this one is entirely unsynced. Let's see what it does here. Now I need to turn the brightness back down. And let's listen to it. And of course you have to find certain harmonics for it to kind of hold still. Right now, this one is only with sine waves. But you see that without the sync, actually, what happens is the image really dances around a lot. It's really hard to get it focused and stable in one place. But again, here it's all these phasers, which again are this ramp going through these cosine functions to make them into sine waves. And the interesting thing is that controlling the phase and the harmonic of these things is really easy. You simply just add an offset to it before it goes to the cosine. For example, this one here is, I've just added a 180-degree phase shift between this cosine and this cosine. And then if you get really crazy, see, I've been showing you all the nice clean sort of stuff, but that's Patch City. That's what happens when you start to get a little bit more excited about what's going on. And I don't even know what that's doing over there. Let's zoom out and find out. Whoa, who knows? I thought I'd saved a nice little... There we go. that's starting to look a little bit more like what it's meant to look like. So again, it's all just it's a huge convergence of interests. We can maybe turn the audio down just a bit. It's a big, huge convergence of interests because we're all kind of plundering from the same sorts of streams, and we're all looking at the same old weird math textbooks and these kind of forgotten pieces of hardware that existed in the 1970s in books and things like that. And then it's just kind of implementing them in different ways. And again, this comes from this idea of sharing, this distribution religion that Dan Sandine talked about, that I'm sure a few other people are going to be mentioning as well in their talks. So that's as far as I'm going to demo with this stuff. There'll be some laptops with all of this stuff installed. Actually, those are the laptops that should have a max demo running for the rework here. The scan processing application should be processing to run TED's XY scope. There should be OSCE Studio to run the oscilloscope music, and there should be an oscilloscope simulator on those laptops as well, so that you can look at these things kind of digitally without needing to connect them. And there should be a couple of sound cards so that you can plug those laptops in and look at them on the hardware oscilloscopes as well, so that you can kind of test out the different environments and see which one might be interesting for you if you want to continue with this in the software way. That's about as much as I want to show right now. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And I would love to answer questions.
Do you want to do questions, Derek?
Yes, I do. I would love to.
If anyone has a question, I'll bring the mic over to you.
Or if there's, I don't know, requests, or you wanted to see something again, or backwards, or...
Is there a difference between the vectorhacks and an oscilloscope?
Yes, there is. One of the main things is the bandwidth that I was mentioning, that if you try to run too fast a signal into the vectorhacs, the image just kind of folds into itself, and you lose a lot of information at a certain point. And the bandwidth isn't really that high. I think for sine waves, anything over 3,000 hertz starts to get deformed. It starts to turn into a diamond shape because it just loses its edges a little bit. Whereas oscilloscopes can have a bandwidth of the oldest, cheapest, crappiest oscilloscope you're going to find will still have a bandwidth of about 10 megahertz, 10 megahertz. So it's quite a factor larger. The line quality, everybody that has one of these talks about the quality of the line. It's painterly would be a nice word to describe it. And I think that one of the things that makes it a very beautiful line quality is that that low pass filtering that happens because of the lack of bandwidth. Any kind of weird digital jagginess in your lines gets really smoothed out by the fact that the beam just can't move that fast. And people that are working in lasers can talk about another level of bandwidth reduction, because if you try to run a 2000 hertz signal into a laser, a fast laser even, and it's not a sine wave, then you're going to get something really weird and potentially damaging to your hardware. And we'll hear a lot about that, I think, tomorrow. So yeah, another thing is that this has a really good brightness modulation. The reason people grab these is largely because you can also modulate the brightness of them. And that's something that isn't available on a lot of oscilloscopes, or it's done in a different way, or it needs a really high level signal in order to do it. So it's the ease of modifying these, which Andrew has talked about. It makes them very attractive. And the aesthetics of them, the aesthetics of the image that on the screen are very attractive. And finally, the materiality and the kind of cultural resonance of this as an object I find very attractive as well. And oscilloscopes have their own resonance, which is a bit more kind of laboratory and technical as well, and have a different look. These, you're guaranteed not to have this grid printed on the screen. Some oscilloscopes, when you buy them, this gradicle, as they call it, is it's like a little plastic insert. Sometimes it's even colored green or blue, and the beam inside is actually white. So this green that you associate with the oscilloscope sometimes comes from a plastic filter. But it has that grid printed on them. But a lot of them have the grid either painted onto the glass or actually embedded inside the glass, and you can't get rid of it. So then you have to, that's part of the aesthetic of it as well, is you know it's an oscilloscope because you see that gradicle there, and it has also a very specific visual resonance. I hope that that was a comprehensive enough answer.
I just wanted to add one more note. The ratio has blown me away, especially for if it's used in such a projection or so, the ability to go beyond square format and take advantage of
it's not quite landscape, but it has a weird aspect ratio, and it's not 4:3. I've never really quite worked out what it is. Normally, these machines were mounted straight up so that you could have your little fighter down at the bottom and shoot things that were falling on you and stuff like that. So actually setting it on its side like this is just another, well, very simple hack, I guess. But yeah, you get this really nice aspect ratio for it. On the other hand, when they're standing up straight like this, they look really good when you film them with the iPhone.
Something I just wanted to throw. There. I just wanted to throw out when you were talking earlier about some of the shape renderings is if you've also played with OpenCV in pure data. If there's a port of it, it could be quite interesting for doing some of the conversion to line, that they have some really nice functions in there for getting contour line.
Yeah, that's something that your library does really interesting stuff with getting these contours and rendering it out as shapes and things. And there were some things based on OpenCV that were in they were more in another library called PDP, which also stopped being supported really a long time ago. But they had some interesting computer vision stuff going on in there. There's much less of it in GEM, but there's a few things, but not nearly as sophisticated. So you'd want to do that in something else. You'd maybe do that in, like I said, in open frameworks or something like that as well. So that's what I'm excited to see, how yours do those things. You had a question.
I'm curious about the Benjamin modification that you made. You said there was this grid that you showed. And it was the breakout of the step sequencer. Yeah. Or is that the Wrangler? Or I'm not. That's the
Wrangler. Inside this synthesizer, this is actually two wings of a butterfly, so they're identical on each side. And the Wrangler is Rob Hordike's brilliant invention for this machine, and it works with a very basic topography, which is a linear feedback shift register. So you have this little, it's like a delay line, and you're kind of sending little bits through this delay line, and you can take those bits out, and you can use a really simple, like a resistor ladder, digital to analog converter to get stepped stuff. And because it's a feedback shift register, the last bit that comes out of that delay line gets a logic operation of exclusive OR with the next bit coming in, which makes it generative. And it does really great stuff. And so it's kind of it's a stepped wave, but you don't know what step is coming next. It's a sequencer that you can't program.
It looks amazing, yeah.
Yeah, and I love things that surprise me, like this oscillographic stuff. Also, it surprises the hell out of me. I have no idea how I got this thing, but it looks great. And so the Wrangler sequencer is like a sonic equivalent of that.
Are there any Macs, similar patches in Macs, or is it possible for me, for example, if I took the pure data patches to kind of translate them into Macs?
Yeah, it's all, almost everything works with very basic oscillators and very basic math operations. Sometimes the names of the objects are the same, sometimes they're different. I'm not a big Macs user, so I'm not sure, but if you understand how the patch functions, you could very easily translate it. If you don't understand how the patch functions, it might be a little bit more difficult, and then you'd have to kind of, I don't know, you'd have to get on a forum and ask people what the object translation is or something. However, I would offer the alternate, which is that PD is free and it runs on everything. And it's not substantially different from Max in the workflow, at least. So it could certainly be something that you could also install and play around with in parallel with Max. The one thing that you can't do quite so easily is make it into a Max for Live thing that kind of goes in there.
I asked that question because I'm looking for a way to use that in Ableton.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could use pure data.
There's one. I mean, you could certainly run it on the side from Ableton and just communicate back and forth with. I don't know if you're on a Mac or if you're on a PC. Mac. You can use Soundflower, which is an audio loopback thing to just run channels of audio back and forth. You could get the sound out of this and send it into Ableton. You could send MIDI data back and forth. You could send open sound control data back and forth. That would be my kind of clumsy hack with it. I think that if you wanted to pursue that a little bit more, I think Chris is going to be the one to talk to. And you certainly have a library of stuff that is ready to be pulled into Ableton already. So.
Regarding the scan processing thing, I mean, if I understand correctly, that it's a way of you can have what is discrete information and then have it visualized in some way. And I mean the luminosity, because if it's coming from the, so I was just wondering that has that been used for other data, or do you have any examples of that?
The scan processing, the way that I have implemented depends on an image file format. Okay. However, if you had your information plotted out as grayscale information on a within an image format, then we could scan it definitely. We could use that.
If you have like just vectors with like just values on like different points, you know, within a certain range, and then.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, an image is nothing more than a table of data. Yeah. You know, you've got your x and your y, and this pixel value right here is 0.3. It's only working with grayscale, so you would have to grayscale any sort of image. But if you plotted your data into such a into a table in such a way that you could render it as an image, then we could certainly get it in there and start getting the using the grayscale value of it to do stuff. Yeah, for example, if we could make a plane and have the grayscale information push parts of that plane out, and then rotate that plane down so that you see them sticking up in 3D. Yes, definitely possible.
Just thinking like, for word embeddings that you would have, for example, a conversation, and, for each sentence you have a vector, and then you have one after the other, and then you could kind of visualize a conversation through that. But
possibly. I'm thinking that probably the better way, because I understand that we've been writing about this a little bit off the main discussion here as well. It could be a little bit more interesting to render it as lines instead of trying to render it to an image and then get grayscale values out. That we could render out your text and render out vectors representing connections between them. And actually, TED's XY scope is going to be really ideal for that because it's optimized for rendering text and doing things with text already.
It's not for actually, like, there's no text or like letters involved. It's like a vector that has the meaning kind of encoded, like words that have similar meaning have similar vectors. And that's like, it's used, so like, yeah, if you have words with similar meaning, they have similar vectors, and you can have operations in the space. It's used in machine learning stuff a lot, but I was thinking that you could also,
I think I'm going to have to look at it and really see what it is that we're looking at, and
because the thing is that quite often it's not something you look at; it's just something that you do operations with. But I think that it would be kind of, and the number of dimensions makes it difficult. But if you would do it, line by line, you could get something interesting out of it. Like, if there's like a mood of a conversation or something changes, if there's an agreement or disagreement, that you would see a difference.
Okay. Again, I think I have to see it or see some piece of the data or something like that before I can really say what we could do with that. But I'm certainly open to it, and we could try it in the kind of more in the workshop sessions a little bit later.
It's a lot to think about.
Good. Anything else while we're still here?
you have a multiplexing patch to show? Hello.
Yes. Where are you?
Roland, here.
You're like completely in the dark, so I can't see you at all. Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's look at multiplexing for a second.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
That's an important concept.
And there's actually I don't see anybody out there anymore. It's like you're all so arty. You're wearing all these dark clothes, and yeah. So there's a bunch of different ways of doing multiplexing, and actually Christian has a really nice demo in his oscilloscope music stuff of just simply using like a simple fader that just devotes a certain amount of screen time to one shape or a certain amount of screen time to another shape. All of the stuff in the oscilloscope music setup doesn't use this brightness control at all. But if you do have access to this brightness control thing, then there's other stuff you can do. So let me pull that one up really fast. I do requests. And let me get so we can hear it here. Okay, so here's two shapes. Maybe I can even make them a little bit bigger. So here's two shapes. Now, in vector world, if you just tried to mix these two shapes together like two audio signals, you would get a morph of the circle and the triangle. You would have a single waveform that would have characteristics of both the circle and the triangle. It would sum together. It would be additive synthesis. So to keep these distinct like this is a little bit of a challenge. And then to be able to crossfade between them is another sort of a challenge. And Jonas, you had a nice word for those. What are those? These little guys when I turn the blanking off. I don't know, you said something at the end, they were like threads of love or something, something really nice and squishy and warm. Yeah. Well, this multiplexing, it's one of the challenges, and it's nice that everybody kind of comes up with different ways of doing it. So the way that this works is that there's an equal amount of vector screen time that's devoted to each one of those shapes. The switching frequency is 50 hertz. So half the time we're rendering one shape and half the time we're rendering the other shape. And if I put on the blanking, and I don't draw a blank in my mind, what the blanking is doing is it's simply turning off the brightness for a very short time in between the switching between these two shapes. So now we don't see these little love threads that are kind of connecting them. Another kind of blanking would be to turn off the brightness when the shape reaches the outside of it, because you see these threads that are kind of looping from when the shape is kind of expanding, and then it's looping back to the inside and expanding out again, so you see these little threads happening as well. Another kind of blanking would be to turn that off, and in other patches I do that. In this one, what I was concerned about doing was simply being able to modulate between two different shapes. So there's a switching, and if you were to actually listen to the real output of this, it wouldn't sound quite so nice, actually. Can we turn the sound up just a little? So this is one, the other, but I've eliminated the sound of the blanking from this. If we actually hear the blanking, we would hear a very rough, choppy sort of thing going on here. There it is. So now we're listening to the sound of the blanking as well, and it's not so nice. So I did a few little tricks to make sure that didn't come out that way.
Just just to clarify, for those who are maybe less familiar with multiplexing, this is literally switching between the two signals very quickly.
Yeah.
So you see, your eyes see both at once, and it's displayed so quickly they're rendered together, but actually you're seeing one, then the other, one, then the other. And if you go fast enough, you see both together. And
if you go slow enough, then this is a multiplexing frequency of 5 hertz, which is obviously way too slow for it to fool us into thinking that it's two continuous images. And as you start to crank the frequency up, it also does nice things to the sometimes it does things to the shapes themselves. It obviously changes them because it's chopping out part of the rendering of that shape. So you get these little holes cut in things. Sometimes see here I'm changing the switching frequency. This is 37 hertz. And you get some harmonic, and you see that the circle is responding in a really interesting way to being chopped at that rate. And 50 is just kind of a default for me. Roland, does that answer your question? Should we look at where?
Yes, thank you.
Should we look at it in here? There's some wipes in Star Wars that does. Here we are. We're looking at the Death Star, and now we're on Tatooine. So here's our circle. Here's our triangle. There's some scaling. Yeah, there's a lot of math in there. But there's basically one ramp, and that ramp is that ramp's going up, and you're just reading the level of that ramp. If the level of the master clock is between here and here, show 1. If it's between here and here, don't show anything, because that's the switching place. And if it's between here and here, show the other one. That's kind of what's going on there. This is actually a fairly complicated patch. It's not so easy to break it down quickly, because it's broken into a few places. So there's our clock. Is it between this and this? Is it between this and this? It's just asking simple logic questions, really.
Do you have an 8-channel multiplexing, please?
Which?
8 channels.
In theory, I could do it. The thing is...
Do more now.
Huh? Yeah, okay. Go. The shapes that are being drawn in an 8-channel multiplexer would have to be drawn incredibly fast, because if you were switching between eight sources and it was only on the screen for 1/25 of a second. If you start to do the math, you realize that the switching frequency has to be pretty fast, and then to be able to show the complete image that you're trying to draw, the speed that the image is being drawn also has to be drawn very fast. So it's just doing some calculations and usually a lot of compromise, because you're always going to lose something, especially if you're switching between things. Would you take the microphone, please?
Derek, if you switch back to the original Vectracks game, you see a perfect example of an amazing job of multiplexing.
Do we need to reset it, I think? Let's see here.
If you don't broke it.
Definitely. Dun, 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 dun. Nope, now we're stuck. Oh well, that's...
Well, I'm sorry for my idea.
Ooh, could be, let's see. I don't hear it starting either though, so... Oh, there we go. Yep, okay, good.
So what you see here is an amazing example of multiplexing once the stars are there and the spaceship is coming. So you draw these letters, okay, fine. Next.
It's being very uncooperative. Let's reset. Maybe we... Oh, I think it's actually still too... Oh, it's still too dim, actually. Here we go. There we go. So, yeah.
So there's the spaceship, that's one shape, and then there's all the stars, which is the other shapes. So there's an amazing amount of multiplexing going on there, and it looks perfect. So amazing what they've done at this time.
And if you want to see what it looks like without the blanking,
exactly,
there it is. That's what, by the way, that's what blanking does. You see that here they've actually used that spot killer as the blanking, so that and it's always kind of returning to the center, which is very interesting as well. This is like this is the forensic examination of this video game.
This is so insanely smart programmed. This is shocking.
Yeah, there were some geniuses somewhere in Hong Kong or something that were really going crazy with this. So game over.